The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the LeverX SAP Specification Project Considerations webinar today. My name is Dave Cramp, and I'm going to do some quick intros here, and we will start this webinar right away. We will have our guests, Linda and Beth, joining. Get my page too. There we go. So yeah, I'm Dave Cramp, Director of Sales here at LeverX, and specialize in SAP PLM. Today we have two principal engineers from our staff, Beth Perry and Linda Lesher. Beth's a chemical engineer by her education, and she's been working over 25 years in the process industries with various PLM systems. Most recently, she's working with food and beverages. And Beth has been, consulting on process PLM systems, design, implementation for the past 5 years, and is an SAP recipe development specialist for LeverX. Beth lives with her husband and 3 dogs, and I hear them quite a bit in Omaha, Nebraska, but is open to moving someplace with better weather if someone has any suggestions. So a little jocularity there. And Linda will be our second presenter, and Linda's also a PLM principal consultant with extensive SAP PLM implementation experience over the last 2 decades. She has great insight into the process industry requirements and best practices relevant for both food and chemicals. Her focus is to help SAP clients maximize their business value derived from specification management recipe development. And she's an avid boater on Lake Michigan, weather permitting. So those are a cast of characters today. So a little quick heads up on LeverX. We have over 1,000 employees. We've been in business since 2003, so quite a long time now. We've been working. We're an SAP PLM Silver partner, and we're also a Siemens Team Center partner. So we've just recently done that with the Siemens Team Center announcement that SAP has. We're headquartered in Mountain View, California. So if you think San Jose area, that's kind of where Mountain View is at. We have our major development and implementation center in Troy, Michigan. And we also have a implementation services center in King of Prussia. So if you think of north side of Philadelphia. We also have our European offices with Minsk, Belarus, Kiev, the Ukraine, Wrocław, Poland, and we've also opened up a new office just recently in Lithuania. So just kind of a little bit about our geography there. We specialize in end-to-end global delivery from the very beginning of strategy of why would I want to do something in SAP, to how to do it in SAP, to designing the project in SAP, supporting go live, and then supporting ongoing evolution. And at the bottom, you can kind of see some of the bullets down there of the specializations in those areas that we also work on. So basically an end-to-end global delivery partner. We are also a provider of software products, and most famous for us is our IPS, our Integrated Process Solution Workflow tool. And you can see over on the right-hand side some of the customers that we're working with in those areas, integrating workflow. We're going to talk a little more about that. With any data, we have to have the ability to bring information in. So you see our VLOC suite, which is a very cool data migration tool, drag and drop mapping application, low code to no code type of approach there. BMAX is a really cool tool that allows you to, especially people that are doing recipes, when you move from one plant to another, to move that information from one plant to another. BMAX is a tool that helps you build it and create these new material master views and all that for your various different plants in an automated fashion, which you can drive with that workflow tool. An IQ series tool is just really, how to use SAP and use it in a delightful way. And we also have an IQ recipe development content package too, to help give you a jump start if you're starting on a recipe development path. Okay, so with that, just quick introduction on LeverX and some of the applications that we provide. And with that, I would like to hand over the microphone to Beth Perry to talk about status and version management. Beth.
All right, thank you very much, Dave. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Glad you're all able to attend. A lot of topics that are relevant to specification management, but I'm just going to be concentrating right now today on these two, status management and versioning. Starting with status management. Also, because of the short time, we are going straight for the gold here, straight to the lessons learned. So for managing spec status, the slide says the new header status to use. Should have said it newer. Generally, when SAP brings out a new version, if you will, of existing functionality, it's because it has better or more stuff to offer. And the header status was designed to work with the web UIs. So people implementing today, they're not going to be working in the GUI, they're going to be in NWBC, or they're going to be working in Fiori. Unlike the classic status subtab, the header status is not specific to a change number or to a specific usage or set of usages. Header status, it has complete configuration for what do you want to call your statuses, what your status network looks like, and how you're allowed to transition. Because it turns out that not everyone was a tremendous fan of IP, FR, NC, and RE. And if anyone on the webinar is not familiar with those, they stand for in process or released, non-critical change, and released. But again, with the header status, you configure the status network you want. If you want your specs to have statuses that say routing and approved or active and inactive, you can do whatever you want. The header status covers the entire spec, all the contents from January 1, year 1 to December 31st, year 9999. Just like the statuses on the status tab, the header statuses do control spec behavior in terms of locking and unlocking whether the spec is editable or not when it's in that status. But additionally, header status also makes available preconditioned checks which can actually control how you use the specification object in relationship to other objects. Now on the slide, there is a screenshot. It's a NWBC where you can see that there are preconditions for the next status, which in this example happens to be obsolete, is that you literally will not be able to move to that status unless this particular spec has no active, inheritance relationships, for example. I mean, there's a whole list here, and there's a whole bunch of preconditions that can apply. So if you are using recipe development and you are using specifications with other objects like recipes and labels, these can really be a big help. And I didn't put it on the slide, but it's kind of the obvious thing about the header status is that it actually appears in the header. That means you do not have to navigate to a tab to see what the status of your specification is. It will always appear in the little header strip at the top of the spec when you have it open in any of the UIs. So that's nice. Now, does that mean that's the only thing that you can use? Of course not. The classic status subtab has not gone away. It's still there, and you can configure it back on if that's what you want to use. Different organizations' needs are different. Maybe you just need a real simple indicator, and you can do that with an identifier or even a field in a property tree. You can use a combination of techniques. I'd highly recommend not using both status and header status at the same time, because having two competing status networks for the same thing might be a little confusing to users. And of course, there's always customization. So next slide, please, Dave. Okay, versions. Okay, I'm not going to do the little ditty about what happens when you assume things, but when I say the word version, I have a mental picture of what it is I think that means to me. And it turns out that that is not exactly what every other person in every company thinks. as a version. And not only that, there's terminology as well, where some organizations may use version, some may use revision, some use both. They have versions and revisions. So really, before you look at what you want your versioning solution to be, determine what it is that you actually need and what your users are looking for. It may be that a very simple solution would be enough, is that you just have an identifier that you put a version number on, and it's okay to overwrite for each version, or maybe you preserve the version by creating a WWI output report. Again, what do you need from a version? If you need a more robust solution, you can use change masters to simulate versions. So now you're using the date effectivity on a change master to essentially become a version. So on any given date, you have a specific set of data that will appear when you look at the spec. So unlike other objects in recipe development, so recipes and label sets, they explicitly have versions. Specification objects do not. So change masters is a way to simulate having versions, and you can enhance that because change masters obviously is native SAP functionality. There's no customizing needed to do it. You can add an identifier if you need to have, a counter to identify a version number or a revision number. And additionally, when you do that, when you use a change master, you can essentially track your versions in Object Navigator. And Linda will talk about that in a little more detail later on. So some considerations, other considerations about versioning. Using change masters to simulate versions is a big change. Everyone's going to need to become very familiar with the key date concept. Lots of companies have done it, but it does require some getting used to. So there's just kind of a heads up on that. If you do go to using change masters, would want to look at, are you going to require them absolutely? So do you need a change master to even create a spec in the first place? I found that if you put that requirement in place, that may limit your product development activities. You want your R&D people to feel free to create specs to play with, and maybe you don't need a change number right from the beginning. And if you're really not happy with, simple isn't enough and change masters isn't going to work for you, there are multiple ways you can customize the system to deliver versions. They tend to be rather hefty, extensive customizations, but they are always possible. So what you're seeing on the slide now are some screenshots from a Fiori system. So I want to give you a couple of different look and feels. So when you apply a change number to a specification, you can actually do that during the create phase or the change phase. There's a wide open field to do that. And there's a dedicated place to see the change number on the basic data tab. However, if you do apply a change number, it will also appear in the spec header strip. So again, using the native SAP functionality, using change masters, just like using header status, means you see the key information about the spec on top every time you open the spec. So next slide, please, Dave. Thank you. All right, probably the biggest thing is that nothing exists as an island. When you're doing your design or your redesign, you don't ever want to look at any of these things in isolation. And because they tend to work with each other so heavily in business process, really want to look at managing versioning and status together. Preferentially, you want to work with the latest out-of-the-box SAP functionality. So for what we're talking about, that's using the header status subtab, and change masters in a web UI. When you use the SAP functionality, this can reduce the amount of customizations that you need overall. Now, of course, it's in any project, the goal is always to minimize customizing. I have gone in on projects where, you know, client has actually said, we're going to do a vanilla implementation. We're not going to do any customizing. I have never seen that actually happen. There's always some level of customizing that's done. But essentially, if you go with the flow and you use the functionality that's available, you'll have less that you need to customize. The second thing in looking at versions and status management is that there are a lot of tools that will allow you to automate things. You don't have to depend on your users manually going in and clicking on a button to change status or to increment a version or revision counter. So some of the ways that you can automate, the first is to use the engineering record object. This is a standard SAP object. It has its own status network, and you can, through configuration, and it is configuration, not customization, the engineering record itself can create the change master and inactivate a change master according to whatever business process you design. Engineering records can also handle multiple object types and items, so you can use a single engineering record to manage status and versioning of multiple specifications, in addition to recipes and labels and materials and documents. The other big piece of automation is to use workflow, where you can actually have tasks in the workflow that literally modify the header status for you, that literally increment an identifier for version number, tasks that pass and apply change numbers to specifications so a user doesn't have to do it. And this is a tremendous help in reducing any, manual errors or oversights or, oh, I forgot to do this, if you allow the system to do it for you. And of course, with automation, you're using your organization's own business processes, so that just makes it easier for everyone to follow along. So next slide, please, Dave. Okay, I just want to close with a real life example. Linda and I have worked on lots of different projects with lots of different companies. We recently encountered a situation where we're both working on SAP PLM recipe development implementations. They're relatively concurrent, on the same general timeline for different companies in different industry segments that have different data models and different requirements, but they are both using multiple spec types that have relationships to other objects in RD. And independently derived, we both ended up with solutions. Now, they're not identical solutions, but the elements that led to that solution we're using specification header status with configured status networks that are particular to that organization, using change masters, using engineering records, using the LeverX IPS workflow tool, and that workflow incorporates system tasks that automate things so that users don't have to. And there's a NWBC screenshot of an engineering record so you can get a taste of what it looks like. And with that, I'm going to close out and hand it over to Linda, who's going to talk about impact analysis and workflow. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Beth. And I'm happy to talk to everybody today and continue with the concept of lessons learned with respect to specification lifecycle management, and specifically in the circumstance where we are using formal change control, meaning that we are adopting the key date concept and making changes to specifications with change numbers. So one of the things, and especially when you change a specification and you want to understand what other dependent objects are going to be affected by this. So a lesson learned was that we'll use some of the out-of-the-box tools that are available. In this case, the Object Navigator, which is available with the web user interfaces, NetWeaver Business Client and Fiori, offers some really great features for you to leverage. So the Object Navigator is where you start with one object, and then you can see the relationship to other objects from that one object and keep pulling information and deriving more impact information and flesh out your knowledge about what is going to be changed in kind of two aspects here. I have the classic screenshot here where you can do a where used. If you're using specifications that are used in recipes, you can see that information, understand change impact in that regard. So you have that master data impact analysis you're doing. And then you can also understand how you might need to deal with some of the change, the timing of when you make this change. You also can see if, what were the past changes that were being done, what were recently done on this object. And are there any other changes that are also active right now? You want to make sure you can anticipate and prevent conflicts and changes. Because if you make a change in a different order and you don't have the right sequence of changes, you might not learn. Use the Object Navigator to your advantage. Very easy out of the box. Slide. Not only can we use the Object Navigator to help us understand us talked about using the engineering record is a great object to use to help orchestrate changes that are needed to many data objects potentially at the same time. I might be making this change to a specification, and I also want to make the change to dependent recipes at the same time. And I want to list those recipes that are being changed on my engineering record. I can use a feature within the Navigator function to help add those objects by selectively taking them off the list, and they get copied and added to my engineering record so I don't have to go through an awkward cut paste kind of scenario. Can come in real handy. And obviously you have all the other features related to the Navigator functions that helps you look at information. It's close at hand information. You can look at change docs, what were changed. You could download the data. You could put the data into a report and use that report as a basis for a markup, and perhaps help you define your change and document or justify your change. Okay, next slide. Along the same lines, I was saying, like Beth said, automate. Being able to manage change or multiple objects that need to change at the same time can be very cumbersome in a complex environment. So use IPS Workflow to help manage not only the process, but also manage the data changes. So people need to be involved and master data needs to be changed. So you have a couple of options that you can use when you want to apply workflow in the specification management space. One could be to create an IPS ticket. It's kind of a generic workflow that you could use. One example might be to use a ticket as a request process, the precursor to actually making your changes to the data objects. And then the second would be to supplement the engineering record, that is making the changes to the data objects, supplement that with workflow to coordinate the tasks such as approvals, other implementation steps, the very painstaking tasks of stepping all of your objects through their status network to get to a coordinated release process, and also, automate where possible. Another huge benefit of using IPS workflows, whether it be a ticket with an ER, is probably in a word, visibility. I can't overstate how often people are saying, you know, I started this process, I put something into a workflow and it started, and I have no idea where it is. Where is this? Where is it stuck? What's left to be done? Who's holding it up? Did this ever happen? So you have a tremendous amount of functionality within the IPS workflow to have visibility and see where a process is at, what's coming, and also gather information from that process after the fact, such as KPIs and metrics, to help you build for process improvements. And lastly, just a quick example, and I think I'll end there, where this is kind of a visual example of the kind of things you could do inside IPS workflow enhanced processes. So within, you could have one workflow or you could have two workflows. In this case, I have a ticket that's a request process that triggers an additional process within the engineering record that implements the change. And then you can see how you could go through steps within each of these process or just one of them and be able to have engagement with people to do tasks or approvals, have system automation to do tasks that you can run logic for to take that burden off of people, and have tasks that where you just let people know that things have happened. And that is it from my side. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Linda and Beth. You know, that was great discussions that we had. I was just going to close it with, you know, one screen. You know, we talked a little bit about change control and managing different processes with the LeverX IPS workflow application. Linda and Beth, as I said, they're working in two different industries, doing rollouts on a recipe development process. And you know, with the numbers of process industry companies that we've implemented in, this is just wanted to show you some of the different scenarios that we have built workflow processes in. And I think you'll go down, read that list, and see these are things that you're doing every day. And going back to Linda's thought of being able to have the visibility of where these, you know, new product introduction, where's that at? I need to make this as soon as I can. How can I release it? And, you know, the changes, you know, product obsolescence, regulatory compliance checks. Once again, just a number of different ways that you can use the workflow tool to give you insight and manage these business processes for you. With that, I'm going to go into questions and answers. So if you have any questions, if you haven't already posted them, the chat window in your sidebar, just go down to the chat portion of the GoToWebinar and type in any questions you might have. Excuse me. So I got, you know, here's a couple questions that have already been posted. How does SAP support exporting specification data, you know, for example, like to an Excel spreadsheet? Beth, Linda, can you maybe make a comment on that?
Oh, sure, Dave. There are lots of places within the specification object where there is literally an export button, which is designed to take the data that you're looking at on the screen and essentially feed it directly into an Excel spreadsheet. So it's very possible to do it automatically from inside the system. You don't have to do any complicated copying and pasting operations.
Okay. Thank you, Beth. Okay, here's another question. How do environmental health safety management specs differ from an SAP recipe development PLM spec? Is there a difference? What is the difference between those?
I would say that underneath the covers, I mean, a specification used strictly by regulatory or EHS, or a specification used for other purposes, such as, you know, defining the properties of food or packaging elements, they really aren't different. They're the same object, they are the same database structure in the system. What they are different for is how you configure them and their intended use and the properties that you would include within those specification types. So I would say we go beyond the real sub, pure sub, raw sub specification types, and now we enter into some other spec types, such as those that represent, packaging elements or other aspects of development that go beyond just EH&S. I don't know if you have a short answer to add to that, Beth, but they do have, you can configure separate capabilities. And then I've also seen there's overlap between regulatory use and perhaps your R&D use. And then you would manage that combined use across those functions by using things such as having different property trees that act as filters for the data that one group may define or use or might want to utilize more often. But then there would be shared data across those groups. So it can be a very efficient means of incorporating both aspects. You're developing a product for R&D, and that R&D definition also holds information and can be used to help support the regulatory report generation, the SDS that you may need, other regulatory readout.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. One last question and before we wrap up, and it is, does the IPS workflow tool work with other objects other than specifications and recipes?
That's an unqualified yes. IPS workflow pretty much works with all standard SAP objects, everything to do with PLM, so documents, materials, specifications, recipes, labels. You can think of it, IPS can work with it.
Okay, great. Yes, and I agree with that. It's 100% extendable to any SAP object out there. With that, I know we're at the bottom of the hour. I would like to thank everybody for attending the LeverX Specifications Project Considerations webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recorded session and a PDF of the deck that we presented today. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. We have, I think on our next slide, nope, now we have details. We will also put in this deck our emails, so if you have any direct questions you wish to ask Linda or Beth, you'll have their emails there. I think is actually it's page 2 of this deck. With their emails now I'm thinking about it. But with that, I'd like to conclude our session, and we look forward to hearing from you and helping you with any questions you might have on SAP specifications. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.